Afternoon, good morning, good night, wherever and whenever you're seeing us. This is an event organized by the Center for Mexican Studies at the Latin American Institute UCLA. I am Ruben Hernandez Leon. I'm the director of the Center for Mexican Studies and professor in the Department of Sociology here at UCLA. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome today Darío Valles, who is going to be presenting his recent work on Haitian and Central American migration to Tijuana. If you're joining us, you already know that the title of Darío's presentation is Las Caravanas y los Haitianos, Blackness, Anti-Central American Backlash, and the Asylum Crisis in Tijuana. And before I let Darío take the floor, I will say a few things about Darío's work. Currently, Darío Valles is an ACLS teaching fellow at Columbia University, Department of Anthropology, and Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality. As an ACLS teaching fellow at Columbia University's Department of Anthropology and the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality, Darío's research and digital storytelling work lies at the intersection of gender, sexuality, race, transnational migration, and technology in Mexico and the US. Darío has taught at UCLA and Brown University and received his PhD from Northwestern University, and is also part of a four fellows network. Darío's interdisciplinary research has been and is being published in Latin American Studies and Anthropology journals, as well, and has gained recognition from the Society of Linguistic Anthropology. He's also developing a feature-length participatory documentary entitled No Separate Survival on the Asylum Crisis in Mexico, and has been featured in numerous local and global media, including as a regular correspondent for the feminist online radio program, Tejiendo Centroamérica. Darío, welcome to the Center for Mexican Studies here at UCLA. We're very pleased to have you and to learn more about your very interesting and timely work.
Thank you, Ruben, and thank you to the Center for Mexican Studies and Latin American Institute for generously inviting me to speak, and for Brian for your support with the tech today. And I hope, Brian, you were able to get the PowerPoint that I just sent a little while ago. And of course, I wanted to thank everybody for spending their time on another Zoom call to be in conversation with me today. And of course, I wanted to express my deep appreciation to the Lenape caretakers here where I'm at in New York. And I also wanted to recognize that I'm privileged to be here sharing about migration journeys when so many have lost their lives and livelihoods across the Caribbean, Africa, and the Americas in their journey to Mexico and the US. And I can only express my sincere gratitude to all those who shared their stories and time with me, and I hope to honor them. And I will, I commit to working tirelessly for the rights of migrants and asylum seekers. So I wanted to start off with a clip, and I don't know if Brian, we can open it up to the first slide, and there's a video, so if we can play it. There is sound to this. So I don't know what happened to the sound. Well, let's see. Okay, well, the opening clip features Don Celestino Tobago, a Haitian-born aspiring rapper, which is what he was gesturing and what he was mouthing in the clip that was soundless. Unfortunately, I apologize for that. And he, in this clip, was giving an impromptu performance, rapping lyrics in French, Haitian Creole. His friends can be heard in the background, if you noticed, to the left of him, freestyling between Spanish and French. This scene, however, was recorded several thousand kilometers away from the Caribbean island nation, in the border city of Tijuana, Mexico. Um, so I met Don Celestino Tobago in front of the anarchist collective Comida No Bombas, or Food Not Bombs, cafe in the bustling Zona Centro, during the late summer of 2019. And you can see in the background Comida No Bombas, and the anarchist logo with a cutting knife and a carrot. Um, if you look carefully in the background there. So his deft weaving of language was not surprising, mirroring that many Haitians I have met while conducting field work on the effects of hardline immigration deterrent policies on the mostly Black and Indigenous migrants displaced in Mexico. Like many Haitians, he picked up conversational Spanish while living in other Latin American countries, in his case, while working as a laborer in the Dominican Republic for many years. So we were, uh, so Don Celestino, who is in his 20s, spoke with me in a mix of French and Frespagnol, or French and Spanish, akin to Spanglish or Portugnol, right? Peppered with Haitian Creole. So we were able to communicate with each other on several occasions through my ability to speak a sort of Frespagnol. So the ground floor of the building where I met him was and continues to serve as the border city's premier social and resource hub for recently arrived migrants and asylum seekers. In addition to Haitians and, of course, Central Americans, Tijuana has recently attracted other Afro-Caribbean migrants like Cubans and Venezuelans, as well as an increasing number of West African migrants, particularly Cameroonians. Migrants in Tijuana have been seeking entry into the who have been seeking entry into the U.S. Have found themselves facing an extension of what geographer Alison Monts calls the death of asylum, that has sought to externalize asylum outside the US, Canada, and Europe, and tied it to criminalization of certain forms of migration from the global South. While Monts centers her work on remote island detentions, I examine how the evisceration of the asylum system, the US asylum system that is, are being further reterritorialized in new interlocking geographies in the global South. And with it, the local and global production of race. This talk seeks to explore the impact of the increased visibility of Blackness via Haitian migration and other forms of migration trends on the local and national Mexican public sphere. Slide, please. Many of you have heard of the arrival of Haitians in Mexico, perhaps. Spanish language media is rife with heartwarming reports that capture the local reception of Haitians to Mexico, especially in contrast to US deportations of Haitian migrants that have persisted into the Biden era. These include stories of Mexican volunteers preparing popular Haitian dishes that include chicken and rice, in lieu of Mexican staples such as pinto beans and tortillas. These images of Pan-American solidarity often circulate in social media along with national Mexican press. Tijuana's Little Haiti serves as a symbolic and spatial marker of Haitians' presence in the urban space and has captured the imagination of local and international press. The metonym conjures up images of early 20th century European migration to the Americas. And these photos I took of Little Haiti in Tijuana, which is an open air migrant shelter that is located in a church called the Iglesia Embajadores de Jesus. And you can see the sign there and a picture of the area with the Haitian flag featured prominently at the foreground. Speaking to many Tijuanense residents, many are well aware of the ways that Mexican nationals and US expat residents rallied in response to the prominent arrival of Haitian migrants, with local businesses rushing to hire Haitiano immigrant men in maquiladoras and as security guards, while most would end up with working with street and beach vending businesses. Black vendors are now a vibrant public fixture on the street scenes of Tijuana along major corridors like La Línea, where motorists queue up to cross the international border. And this is also, not to mention Tijuana's beachfront areas, playas of Tijuana. It's very common now to see Black migrants, Haitians, street vending on the beaches or vending on the beaches. And of course, Don Celestino earlier on is a street performer himself under the name Don Celestino. So local Tijuana taxi drivers have even shared with me how they have learned of the increasing number of Haitian and Mexican marriages. And they have, I've heard of many stories of these sort of marriages from various accounts in the media and even here in the US among people who volunteer the information when I talk about my research. So this supposed warm reception of these refugees and asylum seekers generally stand in contrast to the well-documented exclusion and xenophobia Haitian migrants in the US, France, and Canada have faced in the past. Not to mention the backlash against migration from the global South across Euro-American nations that have pushed them many to Mexico in the first place. These narratives of Mexicans' embrace of Haitians are often coupled with model migrant morality that I will delve deeper in today. These circulating narratives, I argue, have a regressive underside. Understanding how Haitian migrant racial ideologies are produced and their consequences require a multiscalar mix of understanding Black diaspora and race studies, along with linguistic approaches to map the shifting material and symbolic racial dynamics in Mexico. In what follows, I begin to make sense of the model migrant status of Haitian migrants by situating, quote, los haitianos in the context of Black, Afro-Latin American, and West African, and Ladino indigenous migration from Southern Mexico and Central America to the region. And I will also talk about the way that these shifting racial dynamics are layered upon settler colonial histories. I invite you all to think with me on some of the following guiding questions. Slide, please. How do contradictory representations of Haitian migration and migrant lived realities reflect and reshape racial formations in contemporary Mexico? How do the representations and lived experiences or material realities of Haitian migrants reveal, what do the representations and lived experiences reveal about how Blackness is constructed in Mexico, along with the context of ongoing Black migration? And how are the ways in which Blackness is constructed via migration, in turn, how are the ways in which Blackness is constructed via migration in turn reveal about the representations and receptions of recent waves of Central American migrants in Mexico, including via the Caravanas? And so what I'm interested here is the co-construction of Blackness and Central Americanness in Tijuana, and the ways in which they co-constitute each other and in the public imaginary, that is. Overall, I'm interested in what can a comparative approach to migration in Mexico reveal about the ways Mexicans imagine themselves as a migrant receiving destination, as well as the binaries of sending and receiving and shifting global categories of asylum. Slide, please. And I approached these questions based on several years of engaged ethnographic research among asylum seekers, activists, and attorneys in Baja California, which has continued through remote methods or virtual means via partnerships with grassroots groups in 2020. As a result of the pandemic, most of my work now has not necessarily been on the ground doing the work that I was doing while I uh, um, uh, from where I'm getting most of my data and material and interviews for this talk. So some of what I say is particular to this particular time. And sorry, my fieldwork began in late 2018, early 2019. So right about a couple years before the pandemic began. My work centered on the Zona Centro Clinic, where I met Don Celestino. The free Wi-Fi and friendly laissez-faire cafe staff of young Mexican anarchists allowed anyone to use the internet, charge devices, socialize, and even take naps on the couches during regular business hours. And this collective is also called Enclave Caracol, for those of you who may be familiar with this Food Not Bombs collective in Tijuana. In addition, Food Not Bombs hosted a daily free meal program where indigent Mexicans and migrants alike formed lines around the block to get served a hot plate of vegetarian food prepared by volunteers from the Bici Disidente anarchist bike collective that occupies the basement of the building. The 3 floors above the cafe were home to a multitude of service aid groups, including a medical clinic and an immigration legal clinic where I volunteered. I spent several summers in Tijuana as a volunteer legal French and Spanish interpreter with the binational asylum legal clinic, where I conducted detailed intakes, interpreted legal advice, and handled evidence and followed up with clients. Participating in these asylum legal clinics allowed me insight into the variety of experiences of migrants arriving in Mexico. Interacting with the legal staff, activists within these legal clinics and outside allowed me to understand the legal maneuverings of US-based immigration attorneys and the shifting legal regimes in the US and Mexico, and how such processes involved reproducing and re-articulating racial categories via asylum. Since then, I have continued engaging with grassroots groups like Nativo, a collective run by a Oaxacan and Tijuanense couple that provide art workshops with migrant youth in various colonias and migrant shelters, such as the Embajadores de Jesus shelter that I pictured earlier in Little Haiti. Today, I will focus on how my time living in Baja California from 2018 right to the winter of 2020 allowed me to better understand the ways local Tijuanenses in order to gauge local Tijuanenses' views on immigration, including Haitians, and the arrivals of the Caravanas and the asylum crisis more broadly. Tijuana is a city of immigrants, I was told repeatedly. Aside from the original indigenous inhabitants, the majority of Tijuanenses are internal migrants from neighboring states of Sinaloa and Sonora, which happens to be where my family is from as well. And I also consider myself a migrant to Tijuana in many ways. So Oaxaca and Chiapas further in the south are also very well represented among the internal migrant population, Mexican migrant population that now constitutes the majority of this immigrant majority city. This demographic flux made determining the local temperature about recent arrivals of Haitians, Central Americans, and West Africans and other migrants somewhat elusive, I will admit. But it is also critical to understanding the ways often indigenous internal migration and settler colonial histories are obscured in conversations regarding the asylum crisis. And this is something I'll return to at the end of this talk. I situate informal interviews and casual conversations about migration among both recent and longer-term residents within Tijuana's evolving reflexive self-image as a migrant destination and transport point or transit point. I also use local news coverage and social media to substantiate my claims about the circulation and representations of Blackness and anti-Central American xenophobia. A quick note here, when I speak of the asylum crisis, I'm not referring to any notion of surges. Instead, I refer to, what I'm referring to here are the effects of the Remain in Mexico policy also known by its policy name as the Migrant Protection Protocols, in addition to the post-pandemic CDC's Title 42, which closed the border to non-essential travels and has essentially eliminated the asylum process, and continues through to the Biden administration. So, slide please. Through examining this data, this talk will provide an overview of the ways transatlantic border deterrent policies and new waves of migration tied to Black and Indigenous diasporas are altering racial dynamics and class politics in this settler colonial frontier. Caught among restrictive immigration and legal regimes in the US, Europe, and Latin America, an increasing number of West African, Caribbean, and Central American asylum seekers find themselves displaced in Mexico and entangled in these shifting racial and class politics. I will examine how Mexican and international public discourses create the Los Haitianos image using model migrant tropes, a rhetorical strategy that both minimizes anti-blackness while recycling historical, local, and national anti-Central American racism. To that end, I will explore the Black studies concept of respectability and the ethnic studies notion of racial triangulation and expand them to this transnational geopolitical, and settler colonial context. I will apply insights drawn from ethnolinguistics that have most often been used in the US context and make sense in this emerging multilingual diaspora in Mexico. Approaching these questions is a critical means to parse out differentiating structures of inclusion and exclusion based on race, language, national origin contained within umbrella legal and social statuses such as migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. These questions are also key entry point to move beyond binaries of sending and receiving countries and understanding the shifting ways in which migrant lives are situated within settler colonial violence and capitalist processes and development. Slide, please. Qué bien se han entregado los haitianos. Haitians are so well integrated. Pablo, the young rideshare driver, proclaimed about a middle-aged woman as she crossed our path as we idled at an intersection in Playas de Tijuana. We were en route to the Zona Centro, where I anticipated interviewing Black migrant women at the asylum clinic, not unlike the woman Pablo assumed was Haitian that same morning. The Black migrant woman I was interviewing were mostly non-Haitian, however, and primarily Cameroonians fleeing state violence at that particular moment. At that time, Cameroonians were arriving en masse at about the tail end of the arrival of most Haitian immigrants, and alongside the ongoing influx of the infamous Caravanas from Central America. When I mentioned this, he quickly and confidently dismissed the possibility that the woman would be from anywhere but Haiti, including West Africa or Black American or any other member of the Afro diaspora. Pablo's approbation of Haitian immigration was notable for the boastful manner in which he represented Los Haitianos assimilation to me. At the same time, his views on Haitians were rather normalized among the Tijuanense working and middle class young and old I spoke with on my daily rounds about the city. It was in the passenger side of his compact car that I realized that Los Haitianos, among the Tijuanenses I spoke with, would not exclusively denote Haitian nationals. It served as a shorthand for the larger umbrella social category that refers to marked Blackness in a reductive way that flattens differences among the Afro diaspora in Mexico. Los Haitianos were constructed to represent an idealized immigrant assimilation and tied to Tijuana's transnational image and local economy as a premier migrant destination city. Particularly jarring is the fact that the term Haitiano has come to signify a model migrant position in working class and elite Mexican discourse in ways that mirror respectability debates in the US. While the politics of Black respectability has a particular historical context and the meaning within the US, the concept of respectability politics has been explored in different contexts globally that involves marked different behaviors or populations as worthy and unworthy of state, market, and social recognition. In media and interpersonal exchanges, Haitians and other Black migrants are often lifted up as hardworking, enterprising, grateful, and docile, rendering them more deserving and exhibiting highly idealized characteristics of adaptability to Mexican society. While Evelyn Higginbotham's original use of the term respectability referred to the moral political frames among Black church members in the North during the early 20th century, the term has since expanded to include understandings of how this notion is deployed in relationship among different groups, including in the US and British contexts. In order to better understand the more widely recognized regressive respectability politics that colors representations of Black migration in Mexico, it is critical to discuss and to explore the related anti-Central American climate in northern Mexican cities like Tijuana. What struck me most about the way that Mexicans spoke of Los Haitianos was the way that they created a stark contrast um, to the way that they spoke to and represented los de la Caravana. So, cuando llegaron los haitianos was a common rephrase Tijuanenses used frequently when I would press them on their opinions of the more of recent influx of Central Americans. So when I would ask them about their views on immigration, they would normally they would begin primarily by talking about the arrival of the Haitians, and then sort of tail end that with their views on Central Americans. Sometimes, it took a little prodding on my part to ask them what they thought about Los de la Caravana. Similar to the use of Los Haitianos, Las Caravanas became a shorthand signifier that referred to the umbrella groups of Honduran, Guatemalan, and Salvadoran asylum seekers that began arriving in mass via organized caravans to the region. Many discussions of recent immigration to Tijuana mapped timelines that began with the arrival of Haitians in the early 2010s, bookended with more recent waves of Central Americans via organized caravanas. And so these are just some of the clippings that sort of hail the success of Haitians and assimilation to northern Mexico. Slide, please. So yet this historical shorthand elides the conditions that produce the contemporary crisis. As such, I'd like to take a moment to historicize and map out the divergent trajectories among Black and non-Black migrant groups in relation to each other. In 2010, a catastrophic 7.0 magnitude earthquake hit Haiti, resulting in several 100,000 deaths and up to 3 million displaced persons. Thousands of Haitians who had already been reeling from protracted economic crisis, fueled by global debt capitalism and US military intervention, fled to other Latin American countries such as Venezuela and Brazil before arriving in Mexico. And then, for example, Don Celestino had originally migrated not to Brazil or Venezuela, but to Haiti, which is another popular destination for Haitians. And there was an immigration shift that happened in the Dominican Republic. This map is a map produced by El Colegio de la Frontera Sur, and it sort of gives a nice overview, although some of the lines may be not as circular or unilinear as this map might suggest in terms of some of the Haitians that I interviewed in Tijuana and some of the routes that they took to arrive in Tijuana. They often entered through other countries and had stays in particular countries, primarily Spanish-speaking countries. So as the academic, but in general, there's a general sort of jump from Haiti to Brazil or Venezuela and then to Mexico. So as an economic downturn in Brazil coinciding with the end of the 2016 Olympics and the economic crisis in Venezuela, in part due to US sanctions, has more recently led to the mass exodus of Haitians from those countries through Mexico en route to the US via clandestine land crossings. Uh, due to numerous factors, including bias against Black migrants, Haitian asylum claims remain difficult to win in the US. While Canada had historically resettled many more Haitian refugees under its merit-based system that values Francophone speakers. While Haitian migrants have historically continued to migrate to Canada from the US, um, where they had a better chance in the merit-based system that valued Francophone speakers, the US and Canada in 2002 signed a binational safe third country agreement that would disqualify any Haitians who passed through the US from claiming asylum in Canada. Um, as such, without an alternative path, with an alternative path to Canada cut off, many migrants who came to the US border in 2010 had only one and often uh, rejected shot at asylum in the US. And once they were rejected from asylum in the US, they were sent back to Mexico. Um, whereas previous to this Safe Third agreement, they would have a second shot perhaps in Canada, where many have family and are more able to speak French. And so many of the Haitians I met were interested in going to Canada, and often not interested in going to the U.S. But nonetheless, we're willing to try. So, Cuando Llegaron los Haitianos narrative contributes to their position as respectable migrants, insofar as they are represented as victims of a natural disaster that forced them, of no fault of their own, to flee the island. In turn, Cuando Llegaron las Caravanas narratives are juxtaposed to Haitians in discussions that bring up this naturally produced arrival of Los Haitianos, and that position them diametrically in opposition to each other in very critical ways. Central American migrants traveling from the Northern Triangle region of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador had recently dominated international and local press coverage for their loosely organized caravanas. Transnational activists like Pueblos Sin Fronteras helped facilitate these caravans that lasted from spring 2017 to 2019 in order to provide protection to refugees in transit from potential violence, extortion, and harassment by organized crime, drug cartels, and government authorities in Mexico. Unlike Los Haitianos who fled a natural disaster, the Central Americans who arrived on Las Caravanas are largely represented as fleeing organized crime-related violence. What this also ignores is the ways in which the US has not only contributed via intervention in Central America, but also how it has foreclosed options to leave Mexico with both its through the migrant protection protocols or the Remain in Mexico policies. It also has expanded the Safe Third Country agreements, first modeled between the US and Canada, and has expanded that policy to Central American countries, particularly El Salvador and Guatemala. And these policies have disparate effects on non-Central American migrants, particularly African migrants who use Central America as a route to the US. So despite the history of anti-blackness in media, politics, and discourse, Mexican respectability politics of blackness involves problematic comparatives and reductive understandings of underlying root causes of migration and their interlocking shuttering of asylum. This in turn reinforces a contemporary globally circulated conceptualization of asylum as not a universal right, but a narrow privilege for a deserving few victims, the latter of which is often defined vis-a-vis the racial and gendered politics and histories of the receiving nation. Slide, please. The ways both Haitiano origins and the supposed behavior patterns are discursively juxtaposed to Central American migrants in Tijuana resembles processes of racial triangulation in the US. According to Claire Jean Kim, racial triangulation occurs by means of two simultaneously linked processes. of relative valorization and civic ostracism in relation to an ideal type citizen, that is. In the case of the US, Kim shares how Asian immigrants are continually triangulated to Blackness in order to re-enshrine whiteness as the aspiration and marked Blackness as unwilling or unworthy of assimilation compared to an imagined model, docile, capitalist market-oriented minority. In this case in Mexico, while Black migrants occupy the position of being relatively valorized, Central Americans have borne the brunt of civic ostracization. Central Americans associated with the Caravans are portrayed in Mexican press and social media as overly dependent, demanding aid, and not just linked to organized crime, but potentially bringing with them crime into Mexico. And there's often, in some of the more radical anti-Central American rhetoric, there's talk of invasion and securing the border, etc. So such histories are not new, nor have, as some I spoke to would have one to believe, triggered by the Caravanas. Central Americans, due to decades of civil war and state-sponsored genocide, have historically been one of Mexico's largest refugee populations, particularly at the southern border, in southern border states of Chiapas. While the presence of Central American refugees in Mexico has fueled anti-immigrant backlashes and prejudices in the past, in the current context, Central American migrants are largely escaping drug-related violence and organized crime rather than large-scale internal conflict. And this is something that is going to color the way that they're viewed in Mexico, or has colored the way they're viewed. The governments in these Central American countries are largely complicit in the victimization of their citizens with extortion, kidnapping, disappearances, assaults, and murder, either directly or through the ability of transnational organized crime and extractive industries to capture and neutralize national and local state power. Anthropologist Shannon Speed has argued that the current moment in Latin America and the United States can be characterized as neoliberal multi-criminalism. That is, violent, criminal, and functionally lawless states are driven by profit motives on a massive scale. Speed further shows how, as illicit economies flourish, governments allow them to operate with impunity while simultaneously neglecting to protect the basic rights of their citizens. In the context of migration, Central Americans are publicly associated with the very structural inequalities causing them to flee, just as the interlinked culpability of the Central American, Mexican, and US government and corporate actors in such organized violence disappears or is obscured. As such, Central Americans are then cast as undeserving of public sympathy and human rights protection and criminalized by association within contemporary Mexican moral discourses. The civic ostracization of Central Americans through their association with criminality is more glaringly obvious in comparison to the relative valorized Haitian migrants fleeing natural disaster and economic downturn. In fact, in televised interviews that reverberated through social media, Tijuana's mayor explicitly called los haitianos distintos, or distinct from Central American migrants in the caravans. Haitians came with papers, to quote him. They came with their papers in order. They didn't come in a horde. Pardon the expression. Human rights will be thrown against me, but so what? I still think that human rights are for humans who are in the right. And this is from a news article. Reading racial triangulation in the context of Tijuana's shifting self-conscious status as a receiving country allows us a comparative lens on how social legal categories like asylum and geographies of sending and receiving remap racial categories. Racial triangulation here extends beyond the national frame to global geopolitics, and the process of relative valorization obscure the interconnections of state violence across borders. The activists I spoke to had long taken, so the process of civic ostracism has provided a thinly veiled cover for the growing anti-Central American backlash in Mexico. Slide, please. Activists I spoke with had long noticed and began documenting the exploitation and violence that Central Americans suffer at the hands of military, police, gangs, and others in Mexico, a reality brought to global attention with the recent murder of Salvadorian migrant Victoria Salazar by police in Tulum this March. I do want to pause to say that here that such violence, such as Victoria's assassination, is often gendered and in relation to sexuality. This warrants deeper attention in a separate analysis that I'm working on as a separate paper, looking at the experiences of Central American trans women migrants in Mexico, particularly in Tijuana, and their experiences with violence. Many Central Americans describe occasions of police denying them assistance after robberies, kidnappings, and other forms of violence, even turning around and accusing migrants of inventing stories about being victims of crime to boost their asylum claims in the US. Other perpetrators of such violence include Grupos Beta, a unit of the Instituto Nacional de Migración, the National Migration Institute, ostensibly created to protect and provide humanitarian aid to US-bound migrants in Mexico. And this group goes back to the first major wave of Central Americans during the Civil War, the armed conflict of the Civil War period in Central America. Other perpetrators of such violence, okay, so Grupos Beta has gone as far as to confiscate migrants' humanitarian visas and threaten deportation for those who resist. Even transnational activists providing legal aid to Central Americans at the border have been swept up in the backlash and have themselves been threatened with deportation under Article 33 of the Mexican Constitution. My point about the relative valorization and discursive construction of Blackness is not that Haitians and other Black migrants experience better conditions or fewer challenges in Mexico in relation to Central Americans. It is that the respectability politics and processes of racial triangulation are detrimental to all migrants, including Haitians in Mexico. In the course of working with asylum seekers, Black migrants reported high rates of extortion by the police and price gouging at local businesses and financial institutions, as well as daily public street harassment. For example, Pablo revealed that he was surprised to encounter Haitianos, Pablo the rideshare Tijuanense, in the coastal communities of Tijuana where he had picked me up. His mapping of the appropriate spatiality of Blackness reveals how residents and officials police the mobility of Haitians and other Black migrants outside of the urban core and into wealthier neighborhoods. In addition to eschewing anti-Blackness in Mexico, Black respectability discourses rationalize the economic marginalization of Black residents. Tijuanenses would point out how apt Haitianos were to accept meager forms of employment in Mexico. In contrast, according to another interlocutor, Central Americans refused to take countless jobs offered to them when they arrived. Quote, "Tijuana is not for those who want to cause trouble," he told me. For many Haitian immigrants I spoke with, staying in Tijuana was more a reality enforced by global regimes of racial exclusion and the need to find a relatively stable place to earn enough remittances to send back home to Haiti, which is still reeling from the earthquake. According to Harris, respectability politics can have the effect of steering unrespectables away from making demands on the state to intervene on their behalf and towards self-correction, with the false belief that the market economy alone will lift them out of their plight. In this case, many migrants I spoke to recognized the inequality they experienced. The fantasy of market uplift was really one located among Mexican interlocutors. Again, Haitian migrants were not replicating a respectability frame as much as these were being deployed by local residents, policymakers, state agents, to parse out categories of deserving and undeserving in Tijuana's shifting landscape. Slide, please. Which brings me to my next point regarding how and where Haitianos themselves were even able to speak about their position. It is important to mention the role of language in exacerbating the structural inequalities in the construction of Blackness and Black silence that is fueling the backlash against Central Americans. Grupos Beta has been cooperating with US Customs and Border Protection in enforcing the new US asylum appointment meter system. This process was suspended in March of 2020 when Trump suspended the migrant protection protocols under an obscure pandemic-related regulation, Title 42, which called for the immediate deportation of any asylum claim seekers, supposedly for public health reasons. This metering has, in the last weeks, resumed under the Biden administration, although he has eliminated the MPP policy. But the Border Patrol is still turning back asylum seekers, except for those who are unaccompanied minors. The system, which is currently being challenged in US courts, prevents those seeking asylum from crossing into US territory and instead requires them to sign their name onto a paper notebook ledger known as La Lista Ilegal, or the illegal list among local activists at the border crossings. All asylum seekers, with exceptions of minors, are required to sign on to the waiting list in order to be allowed entry into the US. Grupos Beta oversees the list leaders chosen daily from among the asylum seekers. These designees manage registering new names, assigning numbers, and calling names and numbers from the waitlist at a trickling pace. As of October 2019, there were an estimated 11,000 people registered on this illegal waiting list in Tijuana alone, which has ballooned since the arrival of the primarily Anglophone Cameroonians fleeing violence in West Africa beginning in 2016. Since then, few have seen the list, and it fails to capture the estimated 60 to 70,000 plus migrants waiting to have their asylum claims heard. Haitian populations in Mexico tend to be Creole dominant speakers, though as noted, some may speak a limited Spanish or French-Espanol, if you will, and some may even speak Portuguese from years as laborers in other countries in Latin America. African migrants are even less likely to speak Spanish. In fact, transnational Black migrant aid groups have pointed to the lack of English, French, and other African language translation services among migrant aid groups at the border as a major barrier for this vulnerable population. In 2019, Cameroonian migrants launched a protest against the lack of English and French-speaking asylum list managers at the Chaparral border crossing. So this map is an example of the routes that many West Africans take to arrive at the U.S.-Mexico border. Ecuador for a long time had a visa waiver, visa-free immigration policy in which many West Africans were able to take advantage of and enter Latin America through Ecuador that way. Slide, please. As a result, Grupo Beta agreed to heed the Cameroonians' demand and ensure that non-Spanish speaking list managers are also selected each day. During African and Haitian-led protests in 2019, in government-monitored informal refugee camps in Tapachula, Chiapas, at Mexico's southern border with Guatemala, protesters were met with violent repression, signaling the state's interest in silencing all migrant politics. The term Los Haitianos and its politics again mask the desperate realities faced by Black migrant populations and facilitate a noticeable public silence as a result of this constant surveillance of Blackness throughout Mexico, which is only amplified by their status as a linguistic minority. The status of Haitian Creole, Anglophone, French, and other speakers means that their complaints about their treatments in Mexico falls on deaf ears. Central American migrants are more likely to are Spanish speakers and thus communicate their individual and collective concerns regarding their conditions to a broader Mexican audience. The critical opinions certain Central American migrants have expressed of their living conditions and treatment exposes a defensive posturing by a Mexican public that has been growing expressively nationalistic. Mexican public support for migrant caravans dropped after the border was briefly closed following a standoff between US authorities and members of the migrant caravans in November of 2018. And I'm sure many of you all remember many of the pictures that that circulated about this border shutdown that was a pretty rare occasion. And one that stands out in the imaginary and the memories of many local Tijuanenses as a negative day, particularly for those who crossed the border to work. In late 2018, a controversial viral video of Miriam Zelaya, a Honduran migrant who criticized the conditions at a shelter in Tijuana, contributed to the perception of Central Americans as ungrateful. And I'm sure many of you all have heard of Lady Frijoles, and so I won't go into that, and just for the sake of time. Estás en su casa or mi casa es su casa is understood to indicate a welcoming gesture upon arrival as a guest in one's home in Mexico. As cultural commentators have observed, the phrase harbors a more cynical secondary meaning. Slide, please. That is, it is to make oneself at home. That is, to make oneself at home is in someone else's home implies an understood set of rules, etiquette that the guest should follow. It is rather mi casa es mi casa that would best describe Mexicans' attitude toward guests that comes into focus when one considers the anti-Central American backlash and the regressive undertones of Black migrant respectability. Other scholars of Mexico have written about the plight of internal Mexican migrants, primarily among them indigenous Zapotec and Mixtec agricultural workers who find seasonal work thriving in agricultural industries in the north. The ways these indigenous migrants from within Mexico have historically been integrated in the regional economy and local racial mestizo white dominant social order is an ongoing dynamic that affects the current internal indigenous and transnational migrants that I talk about in this talk, but that's something that remains beyond the scope of this research and begs further research. An interesting parallel, though, are that binds indigenous migrants internally from Mexico and Black migrants are their access to public space and their status as linguistic minorities. So understanding the politics of migrant respectability in Tijuana reveal how Mexican and U.S. nationalists visibly aim at Central Americans as their primary target for civic ostracism. Furthermore, a model migrant myth centered on a form of acquiescence to inhumane conditions perpetuated by local residents and those identifying as explicit Mexican nationalists undergirds ideologies and practices of belonging and exclusion. According to Shannon Speed, analytical frameworks help situate Mexico as a settler colonial state, which fundamentally shapes its legal and political orientation towards indigenous and migrant populations. Settler colonialism becomes visible in the rhetoric of the Mexican First nationalist demonstrations that confronted the caravans in Tijuana, which broadly mapped both Central Americans and internal migrants from Guerrero and Chiapas in ways that locate indigenous migrants, whether internal or transnational, outside of a body politic. Such analysis is at the heart of my developing research, including understanding how Haitians and West African resettlement is situated into shifting regional racial hierarchies that are both anti-Black, indigenous, and anti-Central American. As the border becomes an ever more militarized space and Mexico becomes inadvertently yet ever more consciously a migrant receiving country. And I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dario. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. And now we have a few minutes to pose some questions to Dario. So I have here something from Jennifer Uribe. She's asking, how are you, a series of questions. So you pick what the angle you want to take, Dario, here. Jennifer, anyways, asking, how are you defining anti-blackness in your research? Are you incorporating the presence and treatment of Black Mexicans and Black Central Americans that are not Haitian and from other West African countries in your research? If so, how? And Jennifer is also asking, is there a reason you have chosen to refer to Haitian people in Tijuana as los haitianos and Centroamericanos as Central Americans?
Yes. What I was trying to do, I think the second part of the question answers the first part of the question, and that is that this construct or this idea of los haitianos, in the ways in which I found that Tijuanenses used this catchphrase to mean is it included all Black migrants, including even Black Americans and tourists, as well as West Africans. It became a sort of umbrella social category status that included Haitianos, Haitians themselves, but it wasn't exclusive to them. It was this construct is another way that Tijuanenses made sense of the changing face of Tijuana. That is the prominent visibility of blackness throughout the city, the presence of street vendors, the presence of beach vendors, the street performers such as Don Celestino. They all, regardless of where they were from, Tijuanenses used a shorthand, Los Haitianos, to describe the changing face and the racial dynamics that were occurring in the city as a result of waves of immigration from West Africa, but also from Central America. Whether or not Tijuanenses distinguished. So one of the remaining questions I have now, and where this research is going, is looking at the effects of West African migration to the region, and whether or not Tijuanenses develop a more nuanced way of disentangling Haitians from other Black migrants. So that's something I'm curious to know, whether or not that is occurring, and whether or not there are distinctions made. But nonetheless, I think where I was going with this idea of Los Haitianos and Las Caravanas was that one has negative connotations, Las Caravanas, Centroamericanos, and the other has more positive associations and that are wrapped up in respectability. That is the category of Los Haitianos. And so that was what I was trying to look at, not necessarily the demographic breakdowns.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dario. Our colleague, Maria Elena Ruiz, in the nursing school and also the Center for Research, CSRC, Chicano Studies Research Center, is writing excellent. I could see these divided into several presentations and provided to multiple disciplinary folks in various venues, one potential setting for students, upcoming researchers, another for those of us interested in assisting as health providers. This is, of course, Maria Elena is a scholar and a practitioner of health and nursing, and she has worked in multiple contexts, multiple countries, in fact, in various settings in the U.S. I don't know if you want to react to Maria Elena's kudos here, Dario.
Only that I've also worked with public health groups in Tijuana, Mexico, who have responded to the influx of migrants from Central America and Haiti, and also from really all over the world in very heroic ways. And so I hope that my work sort of helps to highlight the work that people like many Tijuana doctors, I do want to emphasize that there are Tijuana activists, Tijuanenses who are supportive of migrants, who are doctors and psychologists working to assist asylum seekers, and trying to overcome some of the barriers, especially language barriers that exist, particularly with those who are non-Anglophone speaking migrants.
Excellent, thank you. Sam Lutzker in sociology here at UCLA asks, how does whiteness play into Mexican anti-migrant movements? It appears nationalistic and less racial, but curious how that articulates within Mexico's racial system. Thanks.
So I think this gets to the crux of what I was trying to explain. The part of Gina Claire Kim's idea of racial triangulation. On the one hand, you have Los Haitianos at one point, and the second point is the way that they're contrasted to Las Caravanas or Los Centroamericanos. And then the third point would be of that triangle would be Mexicanidad, Tijuanense identity, that is problematically locally situated in a white settler colonial context, white mestizo settler colonial context. And What I was trying to say is that, you know, there's, you know, much of this work is indebted to researchers who have looked at internal Mexican migration from Chiapas and from Oaxaca to Tijuana, that Mixtec and other populations of indigenous migrants that are also, that share many of the same experiences as Black migrants that have recently been arriving. That is their status as linguistic minorities and their position in the economy, as you know, indigenous workers, as agricultural workers, as opposed to Haitians as street vendors and factory workers. So there are many similarities to the ways in which Mexican identity is wrapped up in notions of non-indigenousness, I guess, non-indigeneity, or counterimposed to indigeneity. And now I wanted to just add to that research to say that Tijuanense identity and the rise of Mexican nationalism in that particular region is also now sort of juxtaposed to, or in opposition to, Blackness as well. So it's triangulated in that sense.
Thank you very much, Dario. We still have time for one or two questions if members of the audience are interested in asking. Raul Rodriguez Gonzalez is asking, would you consider Tijuana as the Gibraltar of Latin America? Interesting question.
You know, I think Tijuana could be considered the Ellis Island of the 21st century. You know, so I mentioned earlier the way that Little Haiti, as a metonym for, you know, an ethnic enclave, has really captured the popular imagination in local press, Mexican national press, and international press. You know, I see articles about Little Haiti and Little Haiti, you know, and what it represents in Mexico as a premier ethnic enclave, and really a celebrated one. I think is fascinating, and I see parallels to, you know, 21st century, early 20th century Euro-American migration to the Americas there. But of course, like that form of migration, like that historical pattern of migration, there is an underside to some of this rhetoric that is more celebratory and very much sort of situated within a sort of liberal multicultural discourse. And I wanted to show that there is an underside to some of this celebration and that's also important to focus on.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dario. Let me, you know, there are no more questions, so I'm going to actually make use of my privilege as a moderator and host here to ask you a little bit about the fact that, you know, building a little bit on Sam's question, even Raul's question as well, how is this analysis complicated in the dynamics that you observed on the ground by the fact that this is a border city? And let me just frame a little bit more this question. You know, border cities in Mexico, specifically in the along the border with the U.S., have been sort of constructed as sort of the you know, the ultimate pose for sort of defending the nation, right, against you know, American or U.S. imperialism and expansionism and so forth and so on. So if you know, and this in some ways is reinforced by the fact that a lot of border residents, whether it's in, you know, Matamoros or Nuevo Laredo or Tijuana, have this horrible experience of being mistreated by the border patrol, by, you know, customs and other actors. This long-standing sort of narrative or history it has been also made even more complex by the fact that a lot of, you know, border residents have access to the U.S. market, have access to jobs, or have access to, you know, consumer goods on the U.S. side. So I remember, in fact, in the sort of debates about the presence of Central Americans, one of the fears of that some Tijuanenses expressed is that the presence of Central American migrants would endanger somehow the relationship, right, and the privileged access that some had to the U.S. market and goods and so on. So it's a little bit of a schizophrenic dual, sort of identity in some ways, right? The defense of nationalism, because you're at the gates of the empire, and on the other hand, this sort of privileged access because you're basically there at the border, right? How does this sort of complicate this your use of concepts such as whiteness and settler colonialism and so on?
So I mean that's a complex question that I will not be able to do justice to, but that is something I was trying to play with, this idea that how is it that Tijuana, a city of immigrants itself, and the northernmost frontier point of the continuous Mexican national state, La República Mexicana, right? It's sort of seen as this far off hinterland in the Mexican imaginary as is. And that's very, very much embedded in the local culture. They're very well aware that they are the farthest, one of the furthest points in Mexico and the northernmost point. And they're also a city that has only recently sort of developed as a border city as a result of the influx of migrants internally from other parts of Mexico. I mentioned Sinaloenses. My family is one of these families that migrated from Sinaloa to Tijuana, and where those of us who meet, it's a meeting point for those of us on the U.S. side or al otro lado to meet with our family members in an area that it's a gathering point that is close. It's sort of a midpoint between these two. This circular migration pattern. It's also, Tijuana is also, home to Southern Mexicans, some as far as Chiapas and Oaxaca, and that's a long history there. So there, what I get the sense of is that in Tijuana, there's a sort of contradictory relationship with the status of being an immigrant destination and also being a city of immigrants, and yet, very prominently, very publicly rejecting immigrants, namely Central Americans. There were public demonstrations. The mayor has spoken out against Las Caravanas. The shutdown of the border in 2018 was a very traumatizing moment for Mexicans at the border, primarily because it's a major border crossing area. And I have family members who work on the U.S. side and who were affected by the border crossing in a very sort of economic and material way, and blamed Central Americans, right? They blamed Central Americans for that disruption, as opposed to blaming the CBP or Grupos Beta for the situation in general. So I see, which is why I think that rather than coming out as explicitly anti-Central American or anti-immigrant, given that many of them themselves have migrated to the U.S. or have family in the U.S., there is this way of rationalizing their anti-Central American rhetoric by couching it in this morality, this language of morality and behavior, in order to rationalize this otherwise starkly contradictory these views that they hold, as immigrants themselves. So, which is why I think it's important to not only talk. I think it's impossible to separate the anti-Central American backlash happening in the backlash against Las Caravanas from the discussions of Haitians and Black migrants. I think that in order to make sense of this anti-Central American backlash, you also have to understand how Haitians and Black migrants have been represented as in comparison to Central Americans. And I'm not saying that the Central Americans live up to these stereotypes. I'm saying these are all stereotypes, and these are ways of making sense of these shifting racial dynamics in very sort of shorthand ways. if that makes sense.
Thank you, Dario. We're going to close with this question from, this is going to be our final question from Fernando Villegas. Let me just read how he's prefacing this. There was a case in which a federal judge based in Tijuana restricted Tijuana's police enforcement agencies to detain migrants for minor infractions and turning them to the Instituto Nacional de Migración for deportation. In this sense, what has been the role of municipal authorities, such as the mayor of Tijuana, in responding to Haitian and Central American recent immigration to the city? And what are the differences in treatment on the part of state actors at the city level?
So I think, I don't want to leave you all with the impression that that Haitian immigrants have somehow been, that their lives, despite the rhetoric that they are adapting to life in Tijuana, that they are also not also victims of anti-blackness, that the Afro diaspora in general sort of experiences even here in the U.S. The policing, surveillance. When I mentioned how Pablo sort of was engaging in surveillance of this Black woman crossing the street in Valles, Tijuana, so Blackness is not only celebrated, but it's hyper surveilled and policed in ways that contradict this respectability politics. In particular, I think because of the way that Black migrants and Blackness stands out in comparison to the more white mestizo hues of the Tijuana population. That is the more Sinaloan, Northern Mexican internal migration that is really the dominant group, I think, in Tijuana, particularly in wealthier areas. Whereas, Blackness in the Zona Centro was not as policed. I mean, I shouldn't say that, but it was more, there were more, it's common now if you go to the Zona Centro in Tijuana, for example, to see Black security guards in most of the farmacias along the Avenida Revolucion, along the main corridors. And of course, as I mentioned, La Línea is now, also features prominent Black men, particularly as street vendors, and that makes them a target in Mexico because of the fact that they cannot, hide their Blackness, and that makes them a target not only by police and Grupos Beta and CBP. They're presumed to be immigrants, even if they have a humanitarian visa, or I've even had Black American friends of mine who've gone to Tijuana who've had instances where they felt like they were being profiled as immigrants and not as tourists. So that is to say that Blackness is very much a new way of Tijuana, of Tijuanenses of understanding their city, particularly certain parts of their city, and especially in relation to Little Haiti. They've integrated into Tijuana society, which unfortunately means that they are also integrated into the racial dynamics of the city, which renders Black migrants as vulnerable to state violence, but also everyday interpersonal violence. Black migrants talk about how local merchants will raise prices on them as soon as they see them walk in, and other examples. So it is a major issue that I wanted to highlight, that the respectability politics and the racial triangulation in relation to Central Americans does not necessarily mean that their lives are any better or any more, their rights are any respected anymore than other groups.
Well, thank you so much, Dario, for this presentation. Very interesting, comprehensive, and also very timely. And I'm sure our audience, I have many questions left, and we We will make sure that you visit again as you advance with this project, as you produce your also, visual work that also seems very interesting. And thanks everybody. I just want to conclude by doing a small commercial here. We are organizing a series of events next week with Universidad Autónoma de Nuevo León in Mexico as part of a series called Ciudades de Migrantes, Cities of Migrants. Actually, almost an extension of what Darío has been presenting on today. And we're going to have one event per day next week. So we'll follow us on Facebook, particularly the page of the UCLA Latin American Institute. Darío, again, thanks. Thank you, Brian Pitts, always at the controls, helping with, brokering our relationship with the gods of tech. And thank you. Thanks to the audience, and we will see you very soon. Thank you.